Thanks for tuning in to the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch, and this is this week's episode on the NFL. We got the trade deadline, huge week of games that just occurred throughout the NFL. We'll break down as much as the trades that are happening today. This is Tuesday for me. You guys are getting the episode on Wednesday. I've taken a look. Most of the big trades have just been announced. We'll go through them, unpack them, talk about sort of what I think of how they're going to affect these different teams. We'll take a look at this week's games, how they are impacting the whole gamut of things. But we'll do our, in honor of what we usually do in terms of past and present, we'll get started right on that with Guess the Player. This is your big hint for both of these players. With the trade deadline being today, I wanted to start it off with both of these players that I'm going to go through were traded to different teams. And we'll go through past and present, but that's your big hint is they were traded players, and we'll go from there. So we'll go past first. So players college was Tennessee, went to the Eagles, then the Packers, and then the Panthers. So Tennessee, Eagles, Packers, Panthers. That's really your big and only hint that I'm going to give you. If you need more time, go ahead and pause, because the answer is it's Reggie White. So you got the Minister of Defense, and this is, I wanted to bring this trade up first. The other big hint was jerseys right behind me. I was hoping that would maybe be a clue for a few people, but Reggie was the defining moment of free agency. He was the first really big agent to go, or player to go on the move during free agency. So let me break down the context of that trade and sort of how it shaped going forward. So the Packers had made a trade a few years prior to getting Reggie, which was another huge name. He wasn't as big of Reggie's status. In fact, he wasn't anywhere close. He was a backup on the team, traded from the Falcons to the Packers. If you don't know who I'm talking about, it was Brett Favre. So the Falcons drafted Favre out of Southern Miss. He is just, you watch sort of his documentary. He was more, Jerry Glanville was the head coach of the Falcons at the time. Favre's only contribution was he could throw a football out of the stadium. Like, Gainville would literally bet other coaches that Favre could throw it out of the third deck. And that's all that Favre contributed. Ron Wolf, who was the Packers GM at the time, trades for Favre, gets him up to Green Bay. They need a defensive player. Reggie White's on the market. There's a lot of context that goes into this. Like, Reggie's doing well with Philly. One of the big things that sort of helped, I don't want to say helped, but it hurt Philly in their ability to keep Reggie, was the star defensive tackle Jerome Brown had died in a car wreck. And when Jerome Brown died, it shattered, what Reggie had going in Philadelphia. He was up-and-coming star, was an amazing defensive tackle. When he died, I think it really helped create an opening for Reggie to leave. So Reggie's going to all these different teams. Now, Reggie's nickname was the Minister of Defense. He, after getting out of football, was a pastor. He sadly passed away, over a decade ago in his sleep from, I think it was arrhythmia during his sleep. Rest in peace to him. But from that point, you have a guy that's a preacher. From that standpoint, Mike Holmgren, who's the coach of the Packers, the reason I bring up the whole Minister of Defense, Mike Holmgren's trying to get him. So what he does is he calls Reggie, and it's on the voice machine, and he goes, "Reggie, this is God. He wants you to go to Green Bay." And he just hung up the hoping like Reggie would find that humorous, and sure enough, Reggie thought it was funny. They ended up signing Reggie. The Packers go back to the Super Bowl for the first time since Super Bowl II. End up winning, beating the New England Patriots that year. Huge success. And so that, that was the first big trade, a big movement of a star player, because Reggie was absolutely unstoppable with the Eagles. He came out of Tennessee, and the thing that many people may not know is he didn't go to the Eagles out of Tennessee. He went to the USFL. The USFL, completely different than what it is today. He went to the Memphis Showboats. The USFL was, I don't want to say competing with the NFL at the time. I don't think anything's ever truly competed with the NFL, but the USFL had a much stronger foothold in the game than the current USFL does. It was honestly becoming a thing. Right now, it's more of a, hey, there's nothing else going on during the months of, March to June, so we go watch USFL. That's really it. It was a lot bigger than what it is today. So when Reggie ended up moving on from Philadelphia, it changed the Packers. It was really the first big free agent signing, and now free agency is what it is today, which sort of brings us to the past. For this player, the past, instead of just giving you the player's name as in past, I thought it'd be unique to give the teams, see if you can guess this player again. So his team was Florida State in college, played for Jacksonville first, then the Rams, and now he's on the Dolphins. That should just about wrap it up. If you can't figure it out, you need a little bit more time, go ahead and pause, because the answer is it's Jalen Ramsey. So for me, you think about what he was as a corner with Jacksonville, and I think a lot of people forget, he's on the team that in the AFC Championship goes up to New England with Jacksonville and has Tom Brady on the ropes. See, they should have beat the Patriots on that day. They had every reason to beat the Patriots, just couldn't close it there at the end. Ends up going to the Rams, wins the Super Bowl with the Rams against the Bengals a few years ago. This past season, straight it to Miami. He gets hurt before the season ever begins. He comes back this week, and then he has a pick. It was funny because Mike McDaniels was talking about how Ramsey said he was going to pick six it, and he only picked it, and the Dolphins ended up having set it for a field goal, so McDaniels was poking fun at him. But he is a tremendous player for the Dolphins. He's going to help elevate their squad going forward. Both of those guys defensive. And the reason I also picked both of those guys to be our guest of players for past and present is that's really what the NFL today has been about in the trade market. So the biggest name to come off the board so far today was Chase Young. So the Commanders ended up getting a third-round pick overall to the 49ers for Chase Young, which I'll get more into that trade here in a minute. I thought the one unique thing that I saw today, I want to pull it up real quick, was that the Bears gave up a second-round pick for Montez Sweat, but somehow the 49ers gave up a third-round pick for Chase Young, and you sort of sit back and you go, man, I feel like the Bears got fleeced again for a draft pick, and I would argue that's sort of the same thing. I do think that Montez Sweat has a higher ceiling than Chase Young in terms of what you're seeing on the field right now. In terms of potential, Chase Young. But I'll go into that here in a second when we get to each of the individual teams. Some of the other trades that happened, the Vikings with Kirk Cousins going down with the Achilles injury, they go out and trade for Josh Dobbs. From the Cardinals, you got the Bills trading for a Packers cornerback, help shore up their secondary. The Vikings trade away a starting guard to the Jacksonville Jaguars. You have some bigger pieces that have moved. You had some teams that you would sit back and sort of thought that they pull the trigger. It's 4 o'clock right now. If anything else breaks after this point that had happened before the trade deadline closed, I'll talk about it in the next episode, and we'll get into it more of how it's going to affect those teams, but we'll just talk about those for the time being. When you look at this week's games, you had the Bucs and the Bills that start off. I like the Bills going out and get corner help. It's clear that their defense is hurting. Like, they're just not the same defense. Von Miller doesn't look the same guy that he was last year. Them losing the middle linebacker and losing the starter quarter with Milano and White, it's hurting the team. Luckily for the Bills, they played well enough to beat the Bucs. If Godwin just looks up and finds the ball, the Bucs win the game on the Hail Mary. It was right there. You sort of sit back and watch. And I'm going to say exactly what I said last week about the Bills, that they are a team that plays to the talent of those around them. The Bucs are a good team. They didn't play bad. They played pretty well. They'll go play someone else that isn't as good of a team, and the Bills look just trash. And you sit back and it's so frustrating to watch them because you know they have such a high potential of being a good team. And especially based upon what just happened this week in the NFL, you sit back and you go, the Bills really have an opportunity to take advantage of the AFC being down. Because when you look in their own division, they've been able to beat the Dolphins. The Patriots are not a threat to anybody. And the Jets are surprisingly holding on by the strength of their defense. If they can beat the Dolphins again and just win out on their divisional games, the Bills will win the division. That's plain and simple. The Bills control their own destiny within their own division. However, they have to beat the Dolphins again. Will that happen? I don't know. And it's mainly because of the injuries that have happened on the defense. Them going out and getting the corner from the Packers will help them. Anytime you get corner help, it's going to help in the NFL. I mean, corner is such a difficult position. You think about all the players that get traded, the drafts, the highest percentage of draft picks in the first round are defensive corner. That's it. Like, finding a defensive back in the NFL is one of the hardest things that you can do. And that's why teams trade them all the time. It's also, a free agency has been predominantly a defensive market. And it's just because it's so hard to go find someone on offense to replace that guy that you had. It's easy, and I don't want to say even easy, but when you look at the Commanders trading away Sweat, trading away Young, they still have talent on the defensive line. They still have Jonathan Allen, and Deron Payne, and Mathis. They have a lot of Alabama guys on the defensive line that have played really well for the Commanders, but it's way different from when you trade an offensive lineman, which now that I'm bringing that up, the other big time that the Commanders got sort of fleeced by the 49ers was with Trent Williams. They gave up a third-round pick for Trent Williams a few years ago. You sit back and look at that and you go, why would the Commanders not pay that dude? Now, Trent Williams hated Snyder. I think everyone in the Commanders organization hated Snyder. It was a good time for them to part. I'm happy for Trent Williams gets to go to the 49ers, be on a team that's actually competing, trying to win, unlike the Commanders, who honestly are just in a bad position. When you look at the Bills, back to the AFC East, and you think about them versus the Dolphins, I like what I saw of the Dolphins this past week. I get that they're playing the Patriots, but for me, playing the Patriots, I get that they're not the Tom Brady Patriots. Bill Belichick still knows how to coach a defense. So for the Dolphins to be able to, take apart a Belichick defense, putting up 31 points on them, for me, that speaks volumes. It just helps for the team to keep building and getting better. Them having Waddle and Hill, it's nuts. What I think that the Dolphins are lacking this year, and you just haven't seen as a tight end, like them losing Gesicki, you sort of look at that offense, it's not the same in terms of that. Tyreek Hill has taken over that. He's put up 1,000 yards through 8 games this year, which is nuts. You sit back and you look at that. It's the most yards through 8 games in NFL history. No, it wasn't through it. It was like the 4th most in NFL history through 8 games. He's on pace to break Jerry Rice's record, or Calvin Johnson's record of most receiving yards in a season. He'll have over 2,000 this year. Evie keeps on the pace. But for the Dolphins, you sit back and you look at Tua. Tua's playing really well. Can they just keep it going? Can they find a way to keep that momentum going, keep Tua healthy? He looks good this year. We'll get into some other quarterbacks this year that, will float around the health thing and sort of how it differs. And when you look at Tua, him being healthy, not taking the hits, learning how to fall somehow with the judo lessons, the Dolphins look good. They have to find a way to beat the Bills. And it's in those bigger games. And that's sort of been the story, is that Miami has not beat an opponent who's a playoff caliber team yet. That's the story. You look at their losses, In their wins, they don't have a good win. They have to be able to perform when it comes game time. That's what you're interested to see with the Dolphins. There are 2 losses this year. You've got the Bills and the Eagles, which I get from the standpoint of the Eagles. That is a difficult team in order to press and be able to shine above, but it's one that they're going to have to be able to figure out when it comes playoff time, because they're going to face some good teams, and you're wanting to see the Dolphins to continue to build and get better. You take a look at the next 2 teams with the Patriots and the Jets. The Patriots are just in a position where offensively they are completely out of sync. They do not have the ability to have sustained drives. It's a miss. Belichick has always sort of brought in a bag of, Halloween candy per se, that's all worked. And this year it's not. And for the past few years since Brady's left, it hasn't worked, which I think speaks to the greatness of Brady, greatest football player of all time. The ability to just put anyone in that offense and it work, those days are gone. With Mac Jones, I think it's probably his last year with the Patriots. I can see them definitely moving on from him. It's not Brady's or Belichick's nature to keep guys just riding at a poor level. Brady doesn't do that. He'll get rid of them, get a draft pick, he'll go find someone else. That's just what what Belichick does. Sorry, I keep confusing the two. They're so in sync that now that Brady's gone, that's been the Patriots story. Brady being gone, they have not been able to find the answer, and they don't look to be able to find any type of answer offensively, defensively. They're just missing a ton of guys, and that's why I'm more surprised the Patriots didn't ship off more guys here at the trade deadline to get some draft picks. That's typically what Belichick does, but we'll see going forward for the rest of the year and into the offseason for the Patriots. For the Jets, we talk about just one of the worst football games to watch in terms of offensive efficiency was the Jets and Giants game. Should the Jets have won? No. Offensive center sets the ball. Ref barely touches it. They end up being able to clock it with 1 second in the fourth quarter to send it to overtime. They ended up winning in overtime, which was great on the Jets. Great team win. You sit back and you look at the Jets, and I keep saying this, it all falls on Zach Wilson. Their defense is tremendous. They have a very, very good defense for the NFL. They just need consistency out of the quarterback position. Now, a lot of it falls on Zach Wilson. I would also argue that a lot of it falls on their offensive line more than Zach Wilson because of the inability to run the football. Now, you can sit back and argue and say, well, it's because Zach Wilson's not a great passer. They're loading the box. They're taking away that running ability. That may be a good argument. It's one of those ones where I can never tell. And that's because Zach Wilson's not a great quarterback. You don't know if the offensive line can run block because we're not going to have a different quarterback in there. Until Rodgers comes back, either miraculously somehow at the end of the season of the playoffs or next year, we'll start to learn more about the Jets' offensive line. I think that if it doesn't happen until next year that Rodgers comes back, the Jets are going to be in the market for offensive line help. The Jets will be stacked next year, guaranteed. The Jets are one of those teams that they are willing to take big risk to win a Super Bowl. They've done it in the past. I really think that it is a prime team to make a lot of moves in free agency next year. I would not be surprised to see that happen in the offseason for the Jets. Now, we were talking about the Tua hits, and I wanted to immediately transition over to the NFC, and we'll go right to the NFC West with the 49ers. And the reason I talk about the Tua hits is I want you to take back to last year. When Tua was getting concussed, Tua was not playing well. And when you saw that, you sit back and a lot of people are like, man, Tua doesn't look good. I don't know if Tua's the answer. This is a Tua problem. And now that you're watching him this year, you're going, hey, maybe this dude wasn't completely thinking straight. Maybe he was concussed and was having problems. That is my argument for what's going on in San Francisco right now with Purdy. You sit back and look at this guy. When he's been completely healthy, he's been one of the better quarterbacks in football in terms of efficiency. Like he does exactly what he needs to in Kyle Shanahan's offense and doesn't turn the football over very much. Ever since he's gotten banged up, he's been just sort of, I would say, Tua-like when Tua was concussed. Like, he was just throwing some picks, and that's what I saw against the Bengals. Like, he just threw some that you were like, man, that is so unlike Brock Purdy. And now you sort of know the reason. Like, you saw his head bounce off. He comes out of concussion protocol. You see his head bounce off the turf against the Bengals. He immediately grabs his head. They don't get him they don't do concussion protocol with him. Continues playing, doesn't play well from that point forward. You just sort of sit back and look at it and you go, I think I know what the answer is. No one really wants to say it, but I think he had another concussion during the game. And it's one of those ones that if they can't keep Purdy up and healthy, they're going to continue to lose. It's surprising to see from the 49ers, and a lot of people are going to put it on, hey, you didn't have Debo. Hey, you didn't have Trent Williams. Well, heads up. Like, name another team in the NFL that could lose their starting left tackle and still be as efficient as everybody else. I'll wait. Name a team that could just lose what is arguably the number one wide receiver and not have any type of downgrade. It's tough. Like, are there teams that do it? Yes, but they're extraordinarily rare. To put it all on Purdy and just be like, hey, without these guys, this guy isn't that good. Name a team that is. Like, it doesn't happen often. I mean, look at the Patriots this year. Not the Patriots, look at the Chiefs. You lose Hill, and now you don't have a number one wide receiver. You have Kelsey. And the Chiefs are having huge struggles, and we'll get to that when I get over to the AFC West. But it's one of those ones that I sit back and I look at and I just go, for the 49ers, they're hurting because you got a banged-up quarterback, and you're losing talent off. You're not just losing talent off the offense. You are losing literally, I would argue, your two best players. Trent Williams is your best player. He's the number one left tackle in the league, period. He's a Hall of Famer. Like, the dude will be in the Hall of Fame 5 years after he retires. Set in stone. You can go ahead and, have the bronze sculpture made because that's what's going to happen. Debo is one of the most versatile wide receivers in the league. Running back, can throw the football, catch the football. They move him all over the field. When you lose those two guys, it's going to hurt your team. Now, we'll flip to the defensive side of the ball with the trade of Chase Young. I sit back and look at Chase Young, and I pause on the trade. Here's why. Think about the team that Chase Young is on with the Commanders. It's him, Montez Sweat, Jonathan Allen, Deron Payne, Mathis. It is on paper probably the best defensive line in the league. Like, superstars. Chase was not effective. Now he's going to 49ers, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure on Chase Young to perform, and that's what gives me pause. I get that he has Bosa on the other side. It should theoretically help one of them really shine. My only pause for concern is Chase Young hasn't lived up to the billet on the Commanders for since his rookie year. Like, that's the last time that when Chase Young came out as a rookie, you really saw what I think a lot of people thought was, hey, this is the number one overall pick in football this year. Now that he hasn't performed the level that he has, it's why the 49ers were able to go get a third-round pick, trade that up for him, which I think is a great move on the 49ers' part. I just want to see how does it translate to the 49ers. I think he goes to a way better coach team in terms of just who the 49ers are compared to the Commanders. It is a stark difference. Like, it is completely two different franchises in terms of the direction, where they're going, what the ceiling and floor is of both, drastically different. It gives Chase Young, in my opinion, every chance to be the player that you think he was going to be when he came out of Ohio State. But we'll see. It will just be interesting to see how does he perform given that he's now on the 49ers, because there is going to be a tremendous amount of expectations set upon him with this trade. And when you look at the rest of the division, it's one that the Cardinals are out of it. Like, they trade away Josh Dobbs. I think that he was probably the best quarterback on the roster, and that's including Kyler Murray. Kyler's, I'm guessing, going to come back from injury. It's the only reason that they would trade away Dobbs, in my opinion. They're not going to go with their rookie quarterback who couldn't beat out Dobbs. So it sort of is hinting that Kyler Murray's on his way back. For the Rams, their whole issue lies with quarterback health, which is sort of the big thing throughout the league on this week. It's when Stafford's not in the game, the Rams look like they did last year. They're just a mid team. Stafford's able to elevate and execute McVay's playbook as well as anyone else. Like, McVay went out and got Stafford because he knows exactly what he's going to get out of Stafford. Other quarterbacks haven't been able to hit that level of excellence, and I doubt highly that their backup quarterback, whoever that is going to be able to do that. I don't even know who the guy's name is. The only team in the division right now that I think can compete against the 49ers is the Seahawks. However, they need to continue to distribute the football like they did against the Browns. When you watch I watched the game, you sit back, the Browns have a good defense. The Seahawks wide receivers were making the Browns secondary look really bad. And it wasn't unexpected that they would make them look bad, but it was more of this is what I expected out of Seattle's offense. Like, I expected Metcalf to just do Metcalf things and go up and get every contested football, be the playmaker that he is. You look at Smith and Jigba, who finally has that big moment there at the end of the game against the Browns. You sit back and you're like, man, thank you, finally happened. These are the type of things that you're wanting to see continue to happen going forward for the Seahawks. Walker looks good. I know Maul said it last week, and it's very true. It really falls on Geno Smith. When Geno Smith is putting the football where it needs to be, the Seahawks offense looks near unstoppable. When Geno's not playing well and they have to rely on all those other guys to step up, it's really difficult for the Seahawks to win. They have an opportunity with the 49ers being down. And they have to be able to take advantage of it. When they get to play one another, it'll be a great game to watch. You see a lot of weaknesses from the 49ers. It'll be interesting to see how both of those franchises go going forward. Because what's interesting is 3 weeks ago, before the 49ers played the Browns, everyone would say 49ers are the lock for the Super Bowl. No one's going to challenge them outside of the Eagles. Now, 3 weeks later, after they have 3 straight losses versus the Browns and the Vikings and the Bengals, which I think at the beginning of the season, you probably would be like, oh, the Bengals are a good win. You know, that would be a difficult win to beat them. The Vikings, they'd probably be, a good game. The Browns, they should have no business losing the Browns. And now that the season's at where it's at, you go, they shouldn't. The Browns' loss is almost acceptable. The Vikings and the Bengals losses, you were like, under no circumstance should they lose to those two teams. And yet they did. Now, with the Browns having a backup quarterback, you would even say that game beyond unacceptable that they lose that game too. For the 49ers, it's frustrating because they're not hitting the efficiencies that you're seeing. And what's interesting to me is you watch them on that first drive, and I want to call it the McCaffrey effect. They are so trying to keep the record going. Like, he's tied Lenny Moore with the Colts, 17 straight contests with a touchdown. Next week will be to break the record. It's like they are so focused to get McCaffrey a touchdown early that they operate with such efficiency. They get him in the end zone, and the second McCaffrey gets in the end zone, all efficiency's gone. It's like they do such a good job to get him a touchdown, and as soon as McCaffrey scores, that offense is an absolute shambles. And I cannot figure out for the life of me why that is. Because it's not the fact that they're in shambles, it's that they operate with such efficiency to get McCaffrey a touchdown, and then once that happens, they look like a completely different football team. And that is interesting to me. I think the thing that hurts the 49ers is that when McCaffrey is out of the game, they're really not a well executing running football team. McCaffrey really makes that offense shine, and that's sort of the only thing that I can sit back and give pause to is that McCaffrey's on the field to get that touchdown, and now that he's gotten in, he's taking those breaks, that's when you really start to see the inefficiency it's in the 49ers offense, is when McCaffrey's not on the field. But we'll switch from the 49ers to a team that was really efficient, which was the team that they were playing in the Bengals. You know, last week with me and Maul sitting here, I asked him, like, do you think the Bengals can make the playoffs? And both of us were like, I'm not going to rule it out. It's just very difficult based upon who they have to play in their division. I'm going to sit back and just go ahead and say, I think the Bengals are a playoff team. Like, they are hitting the strides that they saw, last year. It's the team that we exactly thought the Bengals were going to be coming out. I think the funniest tweet that I've seen this year was Joe Burrow, after having 3 or 4 terrible weeks, what he comes out with thereafter, and it's Tom Brady coming out for the Super Bowl. It's like, that's exactly what they've been like. He has been playing at the highest level of quarterback since they beat the Rams. Like, once the Bengals beat the Rams at home, the Bengals have started to regain the form that they have. They're taking the deep shots, which was missing from the offense. I like what I'm seeing out of the Bengals right now. And it helps that the other teams in their division don't look good. You got the Steelers. Pickett's an absolute nightmare until they solve the quarterback position. Like, they're just hurting in terms of that. The Ravens, probably the biggest competition to the division crown for the Bengals, but you sit back and you watch them play Arizona and you just go, man, they were missing a lot of opportunities that you really thought that they would take more of an advantage of. It was one of those games that you really wanted to see a week after they just blew out the Lions to really hold the Cardinals to nothing, and the Cardinals kept making it interesting. For the Ravens going forward, like, their offense looks really good. I would argue that they still have a lot of injuries on the secondary side, and that's where they're giving up a lot of yards. And that's scary when you think about them having to play the Bengals, is the Bengals have that offensive efficiency to beat up the Ravens on that side of the football. We'll see what happens when they meet up again, but if you had to pick right now, I'd give the edge to the Bengals. And then the only other team which has been on Joe Burrow's number is the Browns. I can see the Browns still winning that game just because of how dominant Myles Garrett has been this year. I mean, if there's a defensive player that should be looked at for an NFL MVP right now, it's Myles Garrett. He's performing at the same level J.J. Watt was a few years ago when J.J. really should have won. He's an unstoppable force. Like, he is changing the game for the Browns. He's keeping the Browns in games, if not winning games for the Browns, because of how well he's playing. The biggest thing for the Browns is what are you doing with Deshaun Watson? Like, P.J. Walker doesn't look bad. He actually looks pretty good at times. But you sit back and you're like, hey, P.J. Walker is like $200 million less than what we're paying a guy to stand on the sideline. Like, Watson has got to perform. Like, if the Bengals have an opportunity, if the Browns have an opportunity to get into the playoffs, it's now. You need your starting quarterback, who you're paying $250 million to show up and ball out. Like, that's what you need. And the fact that he's still on the sideline, it's very frustrating. I think it's even more frustrating for like someone like me because of the quarterbacks that like I grew up watching. Like, you got Brett Favre, like, never missed a game. Like, it didn't matter. I remember he had a pin in his thumb that on his throwing hand that my man's still out there playing games. Like, it didn't matter. Throwing up blood didn't matter. Elway, like, even Brady, starting all the time. And you just think about sort of those guys that it was like you could not get them off the field. And then in Watson's case, it's like you can't get him on the field. It's one of those, it's so frustrating to see. And I'm not trying to dog a guy. You don't really know exactly what the level of injury it is. However, when the medical staff has said that he was cleared to return to the game, if then he doesn't, it just opens the door for a ton of questions of what's happening with Watson. And until that answer is resolved, the Browns are still going to struggle. They're struggling to beat teams that they should beat. I mean, you take a look at this week versus Seattle. They had the game. Like, they had opportunities to win the game. And with Watson in there playing at a better level, you sit back and go, I think the Browns would probably win the game. But the fact that he's not in there, it's hurting that football team. So going from the AFC North, sitting back looking at sort of a surprising team that is in need of a quarterback play, we'll go to another one that I won't say a surprising team, but a struggling team that the quarterback started to play better, and then they just hit a brick wall, which was the Minnesota Vikings. With the Vikings, I will be the first guy to apologize to Kirk Cousins. I sat back and me and Maul before we were recording the game hadn't happened on Monday night against the 49ers, and I was like, well, you can count on Kirk Cousins to be primetime Kirk Cousins. When you look at before the Achilles injury of Cousins is having his best year. And not just statistically, like he's keeping the Vikings, he's having really good games. Like the Vikings losing is not on Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins was doing his job to get the Vikings wins. Other parts of that team were losing the game for the Vikings. And here's a team, you sit back and look at their record. The Vikings were right now they're 4-4. The Lions are 6-2. They beat the Packers. They beat the Bears. They just need to go beat the Vikings, and the Vikings can control their own destiny in terms of winning the NFC North. However, with the loss of Cousins, it's incredibly difficult now. I love the fact of they went out and got Dobbs, someone that has shown efficiency in a Cardinals organization that, think about what Dobbs did at Arizona. It's pretty remarkable. Like, here's a guy that was taken in a trade to the Cardinals and just said, hey, you got about a week to learn the playbook and start. And he kept them in games, beat the Cowboys. Like, the Cardinals did really good things with Dobbs, and Dobbs kept them in games. Now, he also cost them some games. He made some costly interceptions. However, with him getting Addison in a few weeks, Justin Jefferson back, he'll have more talent at Minnesota than he had with the Cardinals. Like, they at least are keeping the door open for victories to happen. Do I think that they compete against the Lions? No. However, if Dobbs comes out and truly balls out, I can see it. I don't have I don't want to say intuition, but I don't have, it was almost like a bet. Like if you told me, hey, I'll give you $1,000, you can either bet on the Vikings to figure it out with Dobbs and be competitive, or for them not to be competitive and not figure it out, I'll probably put my money on them not figuring it out. That's just where if I had to put money on it right now, that's how I feel. Doesn't mean that they can't. It's just I don't think that they will. For the other two teams in the division, the Bears and the Packers, for the Bears, it's almost to the point where you're like, hey, you're almost giving them grace. It's like you're having no Fields. You have an offensive line that's terrible, a defense that's, I would also argue, terrible in a lot of different positions. You've got multiple injuries. You're just trying to win games and not get blown out every week. And at least the Bears haven't got blown out like the Broncos did against the Dolphins. From a Bears perspective, though, do I like going out and get Montez Sweat? Absolutely. Like, it helps their defensive line. Giving up a second-round pick, in my opinion, is not a bad thing. Here's why. A lot of times on, like, Bad News Mondays for this podcast and on our Instagram and stuff, I've talked about teams and what they have missed on in the drafts and who, like, in first-round picks. Like, it's so difficult in the NFL to trust that, hey, I'm going to give up my number one pick, which may be 5th overall on this guy, and that guy just does not work out. I mean, prime example, Chase Young, number 1 overall pick, is now with the 49ers. Like, here is a guy that the Commanders thought, this is going to be our guy. He's going to change the organization. He's going to be the most dominant defensive end in the conference, he's not it. Like, not it. In fact, you look a few years later, the Cowboys take Parsons, not with the number 1 overall pick in the whole draft, and he's turning out to be probably the best defensive end, not just in that division, but maybe in the NFL. Like, he's playing at that type of level right now that you would say who's more dominant than him. From that perspective, when you look at the Bears, them getting Sweat in there helps them. Where the Bears need the most help, though, is they need offensive line help. Like, I felt bad watching them against the Chargers because the kid was running for his life at quarterback the whole game, the entire game. Did he make some bad throws? Yes. But it's like, how do you get into a rhythm when every single play you're on the run? Like, that is the Bears. They need offensive line help. It's hard to do that in free agency. And the reason is most guys are not willing to give up an offensive lineman off of their squad. Why? Because the guy sitting behind them is a backup for a reason. Like, most teams do not have a backup offensive lineman that is a starter for another team. It just doesn't happen. And it's because there's just so few of them. They're too valuable to keep on your bench. You're going to have to pay the guy too much. So guys get rid of them. Where most offensive linemen hop ship is at the end of their contract, teams sit back and they're like, I can't pay this. I get he's an amazing guard or an amazing tackle or an amazing center. I can't pay him because then I lose money on the other thing. It becomes a cap problem. So they move on from the guy and he'll go sign with another team. You look at the Bears, they have the most cap. Next year, it's over $110 million. They have to go spend that on free agency on offensive linemen. They need offensive line help. I think Sweat adds a lot. He's going to add depth to that defensive line. It gives them a lot of pieces. The only thing that I sit back and look at and say, why did the Bears not do that, is I wish they had given up a 3rd-round pick or something else to get Sweat and Young into the building. Like, if the 49ers could have got Young, why could the Bears have not done the same and just got another guy for their defense? Don't know. It's in the past, but that'd be my main question. For the Packers, it's Jordan Love. Like, it's becoming a trend, and I think it's a trend every single year, where you have quarterbacks that you just sort of sit back and you go, I don't think this is the guy. Like, that's what I see out of Love. It's what you see out of Pickett. It's what you see out of Mac Jones. Like, you just watch him and you're like, hey, Ritter, prime example. We'll get to the Falcons here in a minute. But it's like you're watching guys perform and you're like, I just don't think this is the guy. Like, this is not the guy that I'm seeing as to leading a team to victory. And they're not even game managers. They are a hindrance to the team winning. Like, Love's performance isn't just on par to keep a team on pace to win. Like, he's actually being a detriment to their success. Like, and I think I know I'm putting a lot of it on Love. I'd like to put the whole responsibility on Matt LaFleur, and it's because you watch their offense, and you can just tell, like, you got a guy in Aaron Jones, you don't give him the ball inside the 10-yard line and the goal line. Like, LaFleur is obsessed with A.J. Dillon. Every single time that Aaron Jones has sort of been tested of, like, is he the starter or is A.J. Dillon starter? A.J. Jones has showed, like, hey, I should be the starter. Like, Jones electrifies. Last year was a prime example. Like, every single time that I thought, hey, this is the time that Dillon's going to get his opportunity, Jones would come in and shine. And LaFleur is limiting the offense because I think he thinks he knows best, and he's not letting the guys in the field and their performance speak to what needs to happen. The Packers they're in a nosedive, and it's because of the inefficiencies that they have. And it's weird because when I compare the Packers and the Bears, I feel like the Bears know they have a problem, and they know how to fix it. They know what they need to go fix. The Packers, I feel like they're still in the denial stage. Like, we don't have a problem. We don't see anything wrong. There's nothing for us to fix. Like, that's what I see out of the Packers. And until that sort of mindset changes, I don't see the Packers getting better, especially not this year. And then the final team's the Lions. Watched them last night. I think for most people, they sit back and go, finally, you gave the ball to Jahmyr Gibbs. and Gibbs looks fantastic. Like, I liked what I saw out of the Lions offense. They had some costly turnovers. One of them was completely, you just sit back and look at the officiating. I mean, I get that his shoulder and arm wasn't on the ground, but are we really going to sit back and act like his legs weren't touching at no part? He was just on top of someone the whole time. I mean, for the behind angle, you see his legs going down, and I heard him last night. They were like, well, you can't tell if that's his knee or not. And I'm like, well, it's someone's knee. Like, it's clear that he didn't fall on top of someone, Reynolds, and the ball got stripped out by Max Crosby. But you just sort of step back and watch some of the mistakes that were happening in that game, and it was frustrating. And talk about mistakes. And this is my pause with the Lions. The Lions really gave the Raiders opportunities to win that game. And there was two main ones. And both of them came when Jimmy G somehow completely missed and overthrew a wide open Davante Adams. Both times running down the left sideline, both clear touchdowns. Like, if he just hits Adams, he could have even just thrown it up and Adams taking 2 steps off his route to catch it. I still think Adams scores. Like, that's how wide open he was, and Jimmy G could not hit him. And Jimmy G, he just looks like a guy. Every time the camera goes over to him, I feel like the dude's in a sauna. Like, he just has that like cold sweat look every single time. My man's stressed. Like, it's unreal watching him play, because I feel like here's a guy who is completely uncomfortable in the situation that he's in. And I feel bad for Adams. Like, you see him frustrated. He did drop an easy third down, conversion in the game, and that it's super frustrating for him. And then you have 2 complete misses from the quarterback. I feel bad for him because he's had guys, especially with Rodgers, not so much. Carr at least could hit him wide open. I'll give Carr that. But going from Rodgers to Carr to now to Jimmy G is super frustrating. He asked for a trade, wasn't granted to the best of my knowledge so far. I can recheck to make sure as we're sitting here that nothing happened in free agency. But when you take a look at Adams and you sit back and go, here's the guy that should be doing way better than, what you are seeing on the field right now. It's Adams. I would have loved to have seen him gone to a different team and getting the opportunity to do better, but it's just not going to happen with the Raiders. Like, until the Raiders figure out a quarterback and mainly a head coach. I mean, McDaniels is awful head coach. Like, we talked about at the beginning of the year, me and Maul, like, here's a guy that loses to an ESPN analyst. Like, he has no business calling himself an offensive guru, because that team is completely lost all the time. It's super frustrating to watch. But I point that out to say, with the Lions secondary is suspect. Like, it has a lot of flaws. They play very physical, but against a better offensive team, and a quarterback that can actually hit their number 1 star wide receiver open by 10 yards, the Lions have some problems. Like, the Raiders aren't a good football team, and the Raiders kept it interesting. Like, that's not a good sign for the Lions. I think they're playing in the correct division, that the Lions shouldn't have a problem now that Kirk Cousins is done for the year in winning. However, you just sort of sit back and look at the Lions and you go, man, there's definitely some weaknesses here that I think against a better opponent, you're going to get exposed, of which they did against Baltimore. Like, Baltimore tore them up, the Lions secondary, and Lamar Jackson was looking unstoppable, and it really put the Lions out of sync. They couldn't run the ball, and now that they're having to throw to play catch up, it completely messed up the Lions. And I think that's the recipe to beat the Lions. Like, if you can throw the football and just hit these guys are going to get open, you can get up on this team, and this team does not do well when it has to rely on throwing the football to win games. It's not because they're incapable of doing it. It's just because that's not how that offense is designed. It's designed to run the football, be a balanced offense, and be able to use a lot of play action to help Jared Goff and help those wide receivers get open. If they're not able to do that, it hurts that football team. But just as we were talking about, the Raiders will go immediately over to the AFC West, beat up the Raiders enough. I can't say anything else about it except that, the Raiders they're not a great football team. They have a lot of inconsistencies. There are things that you want to see out of them that you're not. And in the same breath that I say that, I'm going to jump immediately to the Chiefs with saying the exact same thing pretty much, that from an offensive standpoint, they are inefficient. And here's my take on why that is. They do not have good wide receivers. And now you're going to sit back and you go, well, they won the Super Bowl last year. And I think that what this speaks to is that Juju Smith-Schuster was still better than the guys that they have on their roster right now. And that alone should speak to the level of wide receiver that they have. And that's not a slam at Juju. I just think Juju's gotten older and, he's not the same receiver he was with the Steelers when he went to the Chiefs. But Juju did exactly what the Chiefs needed him to do. One of which was just catch the football. Like their wide receivers, Tony, Sky Moore, like they just can't catch. They literally have cinder blocks for hands running routes. And the only guy that seems to be able to have any type of production is Kelsey. And Kelsey's getting double teamed every single play. And Mahomes is running. Like it is so frustrating to watch them because they need a wide receiver. They need a guy that can just catch the football and get open. And this is sort of the first year that you're really seeing that they don't have that star on that offensive side at the position of wide receiver. I'd argue that's because of cap. Like you've got to be able to pay defensive guys. You've got to be able to pay Mahomes and Kelsey. It just takes money away. They're trying to do it with a little bit cheaper of wide receivers this year, and it's not working out. It's not me saying that the Chiefs are not going to win the division. I still think they're the favorite in the division. I get that they lose to the Broncos. The Broncos have always played them well. I know that the Chiefs, had won 16 straight prior to this week, but especially the past 2 years, even last year when the Broncos were terrible, the Broncos play them well. Like they seem to be able to develop a game plan that really challenges the Chiefs' weaknesses, and that happened this week. They made Mahomes feel uncomfortable. They really did a good job locking up Travis Kelsey. It helped the Chiefs' wide receivers weren't able to be effective. And for me, what they did was they minimized the impact of Chris Jones. For Chris Jones, you sort of sit back and you go, here's a guy that hasn't been as effective as he was last year, a guy that sits out wanting more money. He gets more money on a one-year deal. He's not going to be with the Chiefs next year, guaranteed. I think he moves on just because he hasn't shown the ability to be such a game changer as he was last year. For the Chiefs, it's disappointing that they didn't go get anyone in free agency to help Mahomes on that offensive side of the football. Outside of the Chiefs, you sort of look at the AFC and I go, it's probably between the Dolphins, the Bills, the Ravens, if they can really find the ability to run the football against the Chiefs. I don't think Jacksonville has the talent to beat the Chiefs yet. I know that the Jags are good, but they haven't been as crisp as they were last year, this year. So I still think the Chiefs, I'm not trying to say the Chiefs are not the favorite in the AFC still. They still are, but it's not a good sign when you lose to the Broncos. This week, great game. Like I just mentioned, the one team that as I started off with the Dolphins, they play in Germany this week. That should be, I don't know how it hasn't been talked about more as like sort of the biggest game of the upcoming week, just because of the impact that it has on the AFC going forward, that if the Dolphins can really put it on the Chiefs and show like, hey, we're a really good football team, then watch out. Like the Dolphins can run the table in the AFC. For the Chiefs, if they come out and Tua doesn't look good and the Dolphins struggle as they have against better teams, the Chiefs will reassert their dominance into the AFC. Outside of, because between the Dolphins and the Bills are sort of the same team. I'd argue the Dolphins are better offensively than the Bills are. With the Ravens, you just don't know what you're going to get out of that defense, especially in terms of the secondary. If this week's game against the Dolphins should be a defining moment for the AFC. And then for the next two teams, I mean, we talk about the Broncos. You sit back, you look at them, they're 3-5. They're not a playoff team. They're not competing in the division. It's more for the Broncos. Do they have the ability to get some good wins to set momentum for next year? Figure out who they have on the roster, where they need to make upgrades, who they can afford to move on from, who they can't afford to move on from. That's sort of the Broncos. I get they beat the Chiefs, but it's still not this type of win that I sit back and go, the Broncos are back. They're 3-5, as I just said. I don't see them rattling off 11 straight wins. Or not even 11. It's, 9 wins to finish 12-5. I don't see that happening. I don't see the Broncos just rattling that off. I think at best over the next 9 games, they maybe win 5. So put them at 8 and 9. That's sort of where the Broncos are right now. And that's at the highest level that I think you could see the Broncos. I honestly think that they can maybe double the win column, and that's about it. And then for the Chargers, you sit back and look at them. They need to stay healthy. It sort of seems, I know at the beginning of the season, I sat back and said, it's just a matter of time before Mike Williams or Keenan Allen goes down. Mike Williams has gotten hurt. They had Eckler come back this week, but Palmer, he gets hurt. His knee's looking bad. Yet Herbert with, oversized middle finger on his non-throwing hand. That was sort of funny to watch. But you watch them and you understand that they have problems because of injuries. If the Chargers team was fully healthy, you would sit back and go, hey, they are a serious contender, not just in the division, but in the playoffs. They are a playoff team because of how good they can be offensively. You just sort of sit back and you wonder, what are you going to get out of them? They played the Bears. They did exactly what they needed to against the Bears. It was funny. One of my buddies who's a huge Bear fan, he was sitting back and he goes, hey, if the Bears win the night, that's it for Stanley, the head coach of the Chargers. He's done. It was one of those type of games. And you could sort of tell the announcers were flirting with saying that they were like, hey, this is sort of a must win for the Chargers because the Bears are terrible. Without Fields, without, remove 2 weeks of the Bears playing halfway decent, you sort of sit back and go, the Bears are not a good football team. There's zero reason the Chargers should lose this at home. They did what they needed to, which is good for the Chargers. However, you want more out of that team, which has sort of been the narrative for the Chargers, I would argue, for probably my entire life. Every single year you go, hey, there's so much more to this team. We're just not seeing it being produced on the field. And more times than not, when you think about the entire head coaching regime of the Chargers, I'd argue that a lot of it's just on the head coach. They have had head coaches that you just sit back and go, this is not the guy that's going to take this team to a Super Bowl. I'd argue that Stanley's right in the same mix with these guys until the Chargers can go out and find a head coach that it's hey, this is a Super Bowl winning coach. The Chargers are going to continue to do Chargers things. Going from the Chargers, we'll go right into the AFC South and wrap up the AFC for this week. You sit back, you look at the Titans. I was impressed because, I don't want to dog Will Levis for eating bananas with pills on him or putting mayonnaise in his coffee. I'll give Levis this praise. He looks way better than Tannehill's looked in the past 2 years or Malik Willis has looked at his entire time with the Titans. Levis deserves to start every game for the rest of the year because he has the highest ceiling of any quarterback on that roster. I feel bad. Malik Willis's entire career with the Titans could be summed up on the one play that he came in and immediately fumbled the snap and the Falcons got it. That's been Malik Willis. It's just not clean football. You can tell that even when they have done mediocre or well against a team, it's usually because Henry's running extremely well. Malik's sort of that guy that he looks up and if his first wide receiver's not open, it's just sort of who knows? Like, it's, shake the dice and throw them. We'll see if we can avoid hitting a 7, because that's where Malik Willis is for a quarterback. Tannehill, you just sort of sit back and it's like, even at the highest level that he was playing, they still were losing. Like, Tannehill couldn't generate great play. In the stat that I heard this week, which was true, that sort of sums up how Tannehill's been this year, throughout the entire course of the season, Tannehill's thrown 2 touchdown passes. Levis in 1 game threw 4. And he made D-Hop look like old D-Hop. Like, you just threw it up to him and it worked out. Like, those are the type of things that you want to see out of a quarterback. The only thing that I will say about Levis, and it's not a negative, it's more just like a dose of reality, is the more he plays, and he could come out next week and still look really good and continue to look good for the rest of the season, the more film they get on him, the harder it will be. And that's the nature of the NFL. I don't think guys appreciate the fact of how difficult it is to be a quarterback in the National Football League. It is people's job. They spend their entire lives dedicating on the defensive side of the football to find ways to beat you. If you show any tendency, if you can't figure something out, they are going to take advantage of it. So the more film that there is on Levis, the harder it's going to get for him. I wish him well. I hope he does well at Tennessee. You sit back and they need a quarterback. If he happens to be the guy that fell to him in the draft that they were able to get, bravo to the Titans. Like, I hope it works out for the kid. He looks better than any quarterback on the roster, and he gives the Titans the best chance to win. So he's got to keep starting. But that sort of wraps up the Titans. For the Colts, and the Colts, I just sit back and it's like, with Richardson going out, Minshew's a good quarterback, but he's not the quarterback that you sit back and go, hey, this is a playoff caliber football team. Now, I don't want to sit back and say with Richardson they would be a playoff caliber team. I think they had a higher ceiling with Richardson. You just can tell with Minshew that it's not that they aren't all there. They're just not a big threat downfield. Like, Minshew's very good in the underneath routes and, hitting a running back in the flat, things of those nature. But those big, huge plays downfield, like they've really struggled at this year with Minshew under the helm. And you see it against the Colts, the Saints that they were playing. The Saints just had the ability to stretch the field vertically against the Colts multiple times. And from a defensive perspective, the Colts lack a secondary. They're hurting at quarterback. It's just one of those years that the Colts are just in a bad position to continue to win football games because of the injuries and because of the lack of positions in the defensive secondary that you would want to see out of the Colts. From the other two teams that are really, and I mentioned the Titans and the Colts first just because I don't see both of those teams competing for the division. I think the division is still between Jacksonville and the Texans. The Texans have a bad loss. Like, I want to give it grace because it's very hard for a team to not win a game in a season. So it was more a statistical probability that eventually the Panthers were going to get a win, and it happened to be against the Texans this week. The Texans played very well in the red zone against the Panthers. It was just that the Texans couldn't offensively get it together against the Panthers defense. They had chances that it was like built on a platter, take control of the game and win the game and beat the Panthers, and the Texans offense really struggled with getting that done. There at the end, they, gave up plays that allowed the Texans to get the ball in a position to kick a game-winning field goal. But throughout that, you just sort of sat back and you were watching, and it was a tough game to watch because there were so many times the Texans had the ability offensively to put the game away, were unable to get that done. Was it a statistical probability that eventually the Panthers are going to show up for a game that happened to be the game they showed up? I'd argue that's probably more the case than the Texans are just on a downfall or something like that. I still have faith in the Texans competing against Jacksonville. However, Jacksonville's getting better. Like, I get that they played the Steelers for what that's worth. The Steelers aren't a great football team. Jacksonville did what they needed to win in a a wet game up in Pittsburgh. It's probably a little bit chilly. It's not a fun environment to win a football game, and Jacksonville did what they needed to win the game. It's what you want to see out of Jacksonville. For Jacksonville, going and getting the offensive guard from the Vikings, I think is a huge move for the Jags, because the Jags get back to how they looked at the end of last year when ETN is running the football well. So them bolstering their offensive line, helping run the football and provide protection for Trevor Lawrence, I think increases the chances that the Jags win the division. If you had to put money on it today, I'd give it to the Jags, just because of how much talent they have on the offensive side of the football, and they have a pretty good defense, especially on the defensive line. I just sit back and the rest of the opponents, I'd still give the hat to Jacksonville to win the division, but you're still wanting to see that offensive efficiency that Jacksonville just hasn't shown, that explosiveness with Kirk, ETN, Ridley, and Evan Ingram. Like you would sit back and on paper you'd go, man, this team should just be throwing up 30 to 40 points a game on the consistent, and they're not doing that. So until the Jacksonville Jaguars improve in their efficiency on the offense, it's really hard to trust them in the AFC. Inside of the division, though, it's pretty easy. Then going over to the NFC for the last division, which is the NFC South. The Falcons really, I don't want to say blow a game, but it's starting to show more and more that Ritter wasn't the answer. It's funny because I texted Maul immediately when it happened, when Ritter got benched, that I was like, we called it. Taylor Heineke was going to start this season one way or another. It was just a matter of time. And I don't want to sound mean towards Ritter. It's not that I have anything against the guy. It was just you could tell from the position of quarterback that this guy isn't the answer. You saw it last year. Like, Mariota looked better than Ritter. Like, they had a better chance of winning games with Mariota than they did Ritter last year. That's the simple answer. Is Mariota a great NFL quarterback? No, but he still gave him the best chance to win. I think Taylor Heineke gives them a better chance to win, and they had an opportunity. Like, he literally hit a wide open receiver on fourth down, and my man dropped it. Like, just a flat out drop to keep the drive going. Like, the Falcons were in the game. They just failed to capitalize on opportunities, and they let a rookie quarterback beat them deep multiple times. Like, that's what happened. Like, when you can't guard the deep ball, that's what's going to happen. When they're able to take the coverage off the top, a team that should have not been in the game was allowed to continue to be in the game. I still think the Falcons are probably the best team in the division because of the fact that maybe now they're going to go to Heineke. I think Heineke is a way better quarterback than Desmond Ritter. He gives them a great chance in the division. However, they're not a strong playoff team. Like, it's sort of like Jacksonville. Whoever comes out of these divisions will be the best team in their division, but they won't be the best playoff team. I'd argue they'll probably be the worst playoff team in their respective conference from the NFC South and the AFC South. For the next three teams in the division, you got the Panthers, who luckily was able to get a win. They found a way to win. It was good to see Bryce Young get a win in Carolina. It will help their confidence. They need a lot of help. They didn't go out and get anyone in free agency, which is surprising. There was a lot of talk about them getting a wide receiver. They don't have a number one pick this coming year. We'll just see what happens in the offseason. I expect the Panthers to still make some moves to try to go get some guys to get on that roster to help Bryce Young out. However, in terms of what's it going to look like for the rest of this year, they may triple their win column, like 3-13, or I guess now with 17 games, 3-14. They're just not going to be a team that plays very well. This was the first game this season that the Panthers have covered the spread. Like, that to me says a lot about a team, that when Vegas is putting money on you and you've yet to even cover it, like, that's just not a good sign as a football team. For the other two teams, you got the Saints and the Bucks. If there had to be a team that I think is capable of winning the division, that should win the division, but is just not executing to the level that you want to see, it's the Bucks. Like, they have the talent offensively, they have the talent defensively. You just want to see them be able to come together and execute. If I had to put money on a team to win, it's the Bucs. I know I just talked about the Falcons probably being the favorite, and it's just because the Falcons have so much talent offensively that they've really just, especially from the running game, been able to run the football the best of all the teams there. The Saints ran the football really well against the Colts. If they can continue to do that, it'll be interesting with the Kamara coming back. It's really between those three teams, Falcons, Saints, and Bucs. For the Saints, the thing that I just sit back and look at was Chris Olave getting that helmet or the football doinked off his helmet. You just sort of sit back and you go, man, like, here's a guy that gets arrested. You know, you think he would come out and have a good game or, you know, try to make up for it. Didn't. Like, he's been mad when cars overshot him. You just sort of sit back and there's problems within that Saints team, and that's sort of why I'm not high on the Saints, is you can tell from an outsider's perspective that the team's not all there. Like, there's internal strife within that team, and until that can get figured out, they're not going to be, you know, a team that's to be reckoned with. Once they get that figured out, maybe. The Bucs, you've got Baker. I think Baker's playing well. They have a chance. Like, it's, in my opinion, yes, I mentioned the Falcons. It's just because they keep surprising me in winning games. If I had to give two teams that I think are competing, it's the Saints and the Bucs. Like, that's who it should be between in the division. If you had to make me pick right now, it would be the Saints just because of the talent they have. I think that Carr is a better quarterback than Mayfield. We'll just find out. It's hard to predict, but at the same time, if I had to give the hand to somebody, it'd be the Saints to win the division. Ultimately, that sort of wraps up all the teams in the conference. You know, great week of just some trades that we didn't see happening, but especially not to the 49ers. We sort of thought that Chase Young would get moved. Now that he's moved, it puts a lot of things in position. And now that it's 8 games, you're hitting that midway season. Like, the midpoint of the season, I sort of feel like it's the witching hour of red zone. Like, it's where wins become losses and losses become wins. Like, we're getting to the meat of the schedule, that this is where we start to see the playoff picture really start to develop and start to see, like, who's going to gain that home field advantage. And I think it's so important, we didn't wrap up all the teams. I just forgot the last conference, which is the NFC East. So before we wrap up, we'll talk about them, because I was about to say we're seeing the teams that are competing for the number 1 seed, and the Eagles are that. Like, the Eagles just need to keep winning, and they need to. I love the fact that they called the counter on the brotherly shove play. Like, they have the ability to still confuse, as good as they are from that specific formation, the ability to use other things to continue to move the football downfield. It threatens everything for a defense. Now that they showed that they can do that and will do that, it's going to force teams to approach that differently. And it helps the Eagles convert more of those plays. Yes, they fumbled one of them. I would call that more of a one-off. They're still 90% efficient on what they do in terms of those plays. The Eagles, to me, now that they are, the other thing I want to add to the Eagles, their inefficiencies on offense have been more resolved when they get A.J. Brown the football. Like, for the past 6 weeks, A.J. Brown's been on an absolute tear. He's putting up MVP numbers at the position, not just a wide receiver, but for the NFL in terms of how good he's been. And it opens up the rest of the offense. Like, Devontae Smith's getting wide open. Julio Jones is getting a touchdown. Like, that's the when you're willing to throw it deep to A.J. Brown and he's making those plays, it forces the defense to be able to say, hey, we can't let him control this game. Go give him help. Go, whoever's covering him, give him help. And it opens up other guys on the team. If they can continue to do that, the Eagles are the favorite out of the NFC. I'm still negative on the Cowboys, and I always will be, until they prove that they can beat good teams when it matters. And I get that they beat the Rams pretty handedly. It's still, they still got blown out by the 49ers. Like, that's the end. And they also lost to the Cardinals. You sit back and look at their 2 losses. The Cardinals is a really bad one. The 49ers was sort of expected. They haven't played a true team. When the Cowboys play the Eagles this week, it will say so much to who these 2 teams are. Because if the Eagles come out and beat the Cowboys like they just beat the Rams, I do not want to hear about the Cowboys for the rest of the year. Like, are they still probably a playoff team? Yes, because of the rest of the teams in the NFC. The Cowboys, unless they can show out and challenge the Eagles, I don't want to hear about them. The other two teams in the division, hot garbage floating down a river on fire. The Giants, they traded away, a defensive tackle. I'm surprised they didn't ship off Saquon. Like, they are a team that needs so much help. They're at the point that it needs to be just a fresh start. A blank sheet of paper and redraw everything. The issue is Maul's brought it up plenty of times. Now that you've paid Daniel Jones this much money, it's going to be very difficult to now build a squad of guys outside of the draft. You just don't have money to spend. You have to build it from within the draft because you've spent so much money elsewhere. For the Commanders, they went out and they've gotten, a lot of guys in terms of draft picks for trading Sweat and trading Young. It shouldn't really hurt their defense just because their defensive line hasn't been as dominant as they should be on paper. The thing I will give, I know I just said they were floating out. If there was one positive about the Commanders, it's Bellamy. Like, what Bellamy has done with Sam Howell deserves a round of applause. Like, Sam Howell looks good. Sam Howell tested the Eagles. Like, the Commanders have continually tested what we would say is probably the best team in the NFC, if not one of the best two teams in the NFC. Outside of them and the 49ers are the best two teams in the NFC. No one would argue that. The Commanders continually give fits to the Eagles and are competitive in both of the games. Last week, or a few weeks ago, they took them to overtime. This one, I get it. That it was going into the fourth quarter, it was a close game. They kept it close. Sam Howell looks good. Like, it is clear that Eric Bellamy knows what he's doing from the offensive standpoint. He's going to make this team better, hopefully with some extra draft picks. And now that Snyder's not in the building, they can make some smart decisions and get guys around him that continually help elevate this team. But in terms of what I see them being moving forward, like, can they beat the Cowboys and beat the Giants? Yeah. Are they a playoff team? No. Like, the Commanders aren't a playoff team. Hate to say it. They're just not a team that's going to compete in the NFL for the rest of the season. They need an off season. They probably need some coaching staff changes in terms of head coach, defensive coordinator. They need to go find some other guys that can help contribute to this team moving forward. But now that I've actually covered all the teams, do want to thank you for tuning in. Go to our Instagram and TikTok for some social media posts throughout the week. And then for our podcast and other media channels, go to our website, footballtalksquadron.com. Thanks for tuning in this week. Time to pull chalks. I'll see you next time.